Hey, you're more than just a face behind a screen tonight. There is no podcast on unsuccessful bank robbers or how to fall asleep in 10 minutes playing while you lie in bed. No, you're a completely different person tonight. You are Napoleon Bonaparte tonight. Not merely a general, not merely a tactician. You are a living legend. A self-styled emperor who, like turning over an old, worn chessboard and rearranging it according to new rules, upended the European power structure. In actual life, you defeated Egypt to bring home a few statues, marched through wet roads in Italy, and made French nobility shudder not from cold, but from fear that they would have to address you as Your Majesty the next day. You, the man who used to look at generals and talk to them, the man who caused Austria to shudder, Russia to freeze, and England to lose sleep. You don't wake up today to lead an army, either not to accept ambassadors, not to choose a country's destiny. You go hunting today. You assume it's only a little hunt. People need to unwind after war. Generals refer to it as a victory symbol. It's an opportunity to assert authority, according to courtiers. On the inside, though, it's just a day off for you. Green grass, good wine, singing, and a few elegant pulls of the trigger at animals 100 times smaller than you on a calm afternoon in the outdoors. They had a gilded, domed carriage, hunting weapons, and rabbit cages ready. You are Napoleon, so you don't have to bother about the little things. The creator of the idea and others perfected. You have nothing to fear, because while you're hunting bunnies, who cares? The carriage drapes let in a light wind, the sound of wheels rolling on smooth gravel, the aroma of leather saddles, and the smell of fresh grass. You haven't seen the planet this serene in a long time. No diplomatic delegations waiting for a decision. No maps strewn across tables. And no artillery fire. This moment may be described as romantic. Unless you were Napoleon, you are unaware that neither Russia nor England nor the army will be teaching the lesson today. However, from rabbits, you will be forced to run an embarrassing defeat because of soft, adorable creatures who are often only meant to be slain and eaten with mustard. However, you are not yet aware of that. Not quite yet. You're still unsure about which gun to get, the ivory one from West Africa or the silver one with your name engraved on it. Are you still undecided about setting the tone by shooting the brown or white rabbit first? When the assistant asks if you would like champagne before or after the hunt, you are still laughing softly. You are at your best right now. Because of this, the fall will be so flawless that nobody will ever think it ever happened. So settle in. Turn down the lights. Breathe deeply. Like the regal robe you secretly deserve, perhaps wrap yourself in a blanket. A portion of history that most history books were too ashamed to document will be lived out tonight. You will meet your match tonight. It squeaks as well. A soft, lilting Austrian waltz. The type preferred by nobles relaxing in their drawing rooms, drinking delicate teas, or idly passing the time between official activities, started to play instead of the angular, regulated precision of a military march. But here, on this expansive field that was turned into a lavish stage, the song assumed a new meaning. It turned into the solemn prelude to an old, nearly ceremonial ceremony, a show in which every little thing, every breath, was focused on one person, you, the emperor. Every person was a precisely balanced cog in a vast clockwork of people and preparations moving around you. Chef placed delicate canapés on silver platters. Hunters honed their weapons. Warriors polished their bayonets. Servants rearranged the folds of cloth on tents, and musicians meticulously tuned their instruments. Every move and action was planned to guarantee that the event of the day went off without a hitch. Napoleon. The whole process was pre-programmed and simply needed your signal. So you didn't have to give a single command. The tents were pitched with perfect elegance. The grass underfoot had been cut to a consistent length, and the cages containing the prey, thousands of rabbits, were carefully lined up with their doors locked, ready to open at the designated time. Along with the smell of freshly cut grass and earth, as well as the subtle scent of polished leather, the air was heavy with expectancy. Your dependable assistant, Berthier, nodded subtly, signaling that you may start. The young aristocrat in charge of overseeing the animals then came forward. His movements were deliberate, and he had the eager seriousness of someone who thought that this would be the beginning of a remarkable career. Reporting for your Majesty. The target force is ready, he said in a quiet voice that was almost heard above the gentle strains of the waltz. He spoke with the assurance and authority of a cavalry officer preparing to charge his regiment into combat. The first cage door then slammed open with a suddenness that shattered the fragile silence, like tiny pearls set in a sea of silky fur. 100 pairs of small, round eyes caught the last glimmers of the evening light in that moment. Tall and attentive, their velvety ears twitched slightly in response to the changing sounds around them, sniffing the fresh air like they were interpreting a secret message. Noses wriggled endlessly. There were rabbits that emerged from their cage slowly, almost reluctantly, as if they were not aware that it was time to leave. Grounded in this odd moment, you raised your rifle and felt the familiar cool stock push against your palm. Some courtiers cheered softly from a distance, as though they were taking in a breathtaking and unique scene. However, something was wrong beneath the surface of this ceremonial show. These bunnies did something surprising rather than scattering furiously as any frightened creature would naturally do. They took a step ahead. Just one step, 2 actions. Next, 50. One rabbit sprang forward, heading directly for your shiny black boot rather than avoiding danger. 2 more came behind it. Next, 7. Subsequently, a wave of tiny bodies moved with unexpected coordination as an animated ripple poured outward from the remaining cages. The atmosphere thickened with an increasing sense of skepticism rather than terror. This had never occurred to anyone as a possibility. One of the braver rabbits sprang and landed right on your lapel before you could even take a breath to calm yourself. As if seeking consolation, or possibly to establish its claim, another pressed obstinately against your trouser leg, its little claws scraping the cloth. Slowly, a tiny group of these cuddly animals gathered around you, like you were a tall bread loaf on a huge kitchen table, alluring and enticing. Even though your rifle was still securely in your palm, there was an unsaid tension in the air. Nobody was brave enough to shoot. No aide wanted to be known as the first to use lethal force against these ostensibly defenseless opponents. It was unimaginable to shoot rabbits, which are such delicate and defenseless animals, especially at such an imperial display. It seemed as though seconds went on forever, when there was no indication of retreat from the furry invaders. You took a cautious step backward and then a more determined one, unfazed and unrelenting. The tiny group of rabbits trailed closely behind, and then everything fell apart. The great illusion of control, the meticulously crafted order, vanished into anarchy. It was a live wave of velvety fur and twitching whiskers that overtook you. The sudden storm of these little, resolute creatures overshadowed the ceremony. The music and the accuracy, silent but unstoppable. The soft-furred army had taken its position. The emperor became the hunted, the master the prey, and the hunt a scene of unbridled chaos. In that bizarre moment, one rabbit jumped brashly onto your left shoe, its small claws clutching like a fluffy killer with a lethal mission. Your body jolted at the subtle, sharp scratching against your glossy leather. Not far behind, a bolder one slipped over the edge of your flowing cloak with ease, nibbling softly at the embroidered stitch that held your empire's insignia. What appeared to have been a tranquil meadow had suddenly changed into a living, breathing sea of soft, spherical figures that were rippling and convergent at a frightening rate, all of them racing toward the main event of the day. You, the nearest guard, motionless as though stunned by the bizarre scene, clutched his rifle. Yet his eyes conveyed a secret supplication. Please, don't make me shoot rabbits. A courtier staggered back 2 steps and almost ran into a wine table filled with decanters and crystal cups. His wide eyes, which seemed to be having difficulty understanding the ridiculousness that was happening to him, were a reflection of both astonishment and incredulity. But then the rabbits suddenly sped up their pace. Not 1, not 10, hundreds. They ran right towards you, fast and determined. In combat, there is a tactic called shock and awe that is intended to instill terror and uncertainty in an enemy right before combat begins. The tactic had been automatically mastered by these small, delicate creatures. But military scholars were unaware of it. Disorienting and overwhelming, their unexpected and unrelenting charge was just as effective as any barrage of artillery. You retreated a tentative step. The fluffy bulk refused to give up. One more step, as if claiming a new territory. One rabbit jumped inside your sleeve and hooked its little claws into the fabric. With unwavering resolve, another scurried onto your gun case and twitched its nose. Between duty and incredulity, the guards started pushing tables away and frantically ripping down banners and colorful flags to make room for retreat. The band, however, kept playing in the middle of the mayhem, their music painfully discordant against the chaos. They may have mistook the show for a part of the ceremony and were unsure whether to stop or keep the appearance of order. Above the commotion, an assistant's voice was crisp with haste and desperation. Go back, go back. God forbid you fall back. Action was sparked by the command that echoed through the audience. Abruptly, the emperor's carriage door was jerked open by an invisible hand. Though your cloak severely caught on a soft paw, temporarily tying you to the battlefield. You leaped inside without hesitation. The rabbits chased after them frantically outside. One jumped wildly onto the carriage step, and another clung obstinately to the spinning wheels, possibly believing that there was a treasure trove of carrots or some other reward inside. Go! Get behind the wheel! The shriek reverberated within, blending with the sound of hoofbeats and harness rattling. The wheels whirled wildly as the driver cracked his whip. Amid the clamor of shouts, the stomping horses, and the distinctive pat-pat sounds not of cannonballs or musket fire, but of dozens of small paws hopping in determined pursuit, the carriage roared onward, sweeping you away. The fading scene was obscured by a dense cloud of dust that billowed behind you. Finally, a few meters behind, a particularly fat rabbit, straining every muscle, collapsed on the grass. Exhausted but victorious, a warrior who had accomplished its task. Your breath came quickly and forcefully within the carriage. One rabbit ear was still attached to your cloak, and it swayed slightly with the movement of the carriage. Several tufts of soft fur were scattered on the polished floor, the remains of a fight that no strategist had anticipated and that no one wanted to remember. There was silence, only the steady, rolling sound of wheels moving farther away, conveying a ruler who had been defeated by a legion of soft, resolute fur rather than by legions of troops. The carriage came to a stop in front of a little makeshift estate on the outskirts of the city, its wheels shrieking violently as it rattled over the gravel driveway. The sky outside was still a pure, unclouded blue, and the soft meadows that extended as far as the eye could see were bathed in the warm, golden glow of the evening sun. The lovely aroma of summer filled the air as the gentle breeze blew through the tall grasses and wild flowers. However, a deep hush had descended upon the carriage, one that was heavier and more stifling than the heaviest cannonade ever heard on the battlefield. Neither the exquisite carriage designed to transport emperors with majesty and grace, nor the weapon in your grasp was damaged. The unseen shell of pride and honor that had protected you like armor for so many years was what had broken something intangible but far more valuable: the delicate exterior of invulnerability, which had been meticulously preserved through triumphs and glitz, now rested broken and brittle, vulnerable to the harsh realities of life. The front hem of your cloak, which was once a sign of royal authority, was obstinately holding to a few short, gray hairs, which were left behind as prizes by the determined bunnies who had boldly and fearlessly invaded your space. One of these creatures had tested the durability of the fabric by nibbling as if to taste the imperial silk itself, leaving a slight mark on the sleeve. The smell of freshly cut grass lingered on the polished floor beneath your feet, mingling with something more elusive, like guilt or the harsh reality of vulnerability. The carriage door opened with a squeak. A servant waited for you to go in silence, his face unreadable. Interestingly, nobody chuckled. There were no jeering voices to break the tense silence. Rather, there was an air of serious reverence, or maybe a mutual embarrassment too sensitive to express out loud. Your faithful attendant, Berthier, was waiting for you at the carriage step, as though intimidated by the gravity of the situation. His eyes dipped uneasily, avoiding eye contact with you. His ears were slightly flushed, revealing a repressed reaction that was torn between human empathy and professional reserve. His face was a mask of rigid control. His job and integrity would not allow him to say what his eyes could not hide. He said in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, "Your Majesty, was the hunt enjoyable?" The inquiry was courteous but stinging, hanging in the air like a silk-clad dagger. There was a thick quiet that went on forever. Not a single escort dared to look up. Each sought solace in little places other than their emperor's face, such as the cracked wall of the estate, a rotating wheel, a stray leaf blowing in the wind, or the worn leather of their boots. You carefully and slowly got out of the carriage. You remained calm in the face of the chaos, proceeding as though nothing had happened. As silent witnesses to the mayhem you had experienced, your high-heeled shoes, which are emblems of status and elegance, were soiled today by tiny, round footprints and the remains of chewed grass, rather than the blood and grime of battlegrounds. The door shut softly behind you as you entered your private quarters, cutting you off from the outer world. In an effort to regain control of your shaking hands, you took off your gloves slowly and deliberately. Still, there was a slight but noticeable shaking. This trembling was not a result of physical weakness or fear. Even the rigorous training given at the military academy at Brienne had never seen anything like it. A sensation that has no name in any tactical treatise, but is unmistakably intense. Humiliation? This scene would never be documented in a history book. A retreat in front of a pack of rabbits would not be commemorated with an engraved medal. But that moment was real, unadulterated, and irrevocable. And it would remain, carved in the memory of a man who was once believed to be unbeatable. You poured a glass of wine while seated in front of a polished wooden table, causing the surface below to become slightly stained as the liquid caught the dim candlelight. Such negligence could have resulted in a severe punishment for a servant in a different era. It was really a small detail today, a transient flaw in a day of great importance. The imperial emblem, a symbol that once inspired terror and reverence on continents, was etched on a brass button that your fingers clasped around in your palm. Now it served as a reminder that you had backed off before a deluge of fur, not before troops or artillery. Delicate porcelain vases reflected the warm glow of the burning candles in the Tuileries Palace's vast hall, creating dazzling reflections that danced softly on the polished oak floor. The soft murmur of discussion that hovered in the air like a thick veil blended with the barely audible footfall. The large map of Europe was spread out on the solid wood table, with battle plans and army movements freshly drafted by exhausted generals whose ink was still wet and whose tactics had not yet been tried. However, as the commotion of the post-meeting luncheon gradually subsided on this particular evening, Napoleon noticed that his mind was straying from the somber calculations of diplomacy and war. He was looking for something different, a brief respite from the demands of empire and the never-ending grind of power. His steadfast chief of staff, Berthier, came up with the idea for a tiny game to lighten the mood and add a dash of rustic charm to the end of the day during this tense silence: a rabbit hunt. What started off as a simple proposal quickly gained momentum, since rabbits are already associated with peace, fertility, and prosperity in rural France's pastoral culture. They looked like the ideal subject for a harmless hobby that might also subtly represent harmony and rebirth. When it was originally mentioned, the courtiers grinned courteously, considering it a charming distraction, a straightforward outdoor game fit for a summer afternoon. However, the concept became more expansive and vivid as it became ingrained in the court's thoughts. They had the ideal setting in mind: a magnificent meadow covered with thick, green grass that stretched beneath towering willows that swayed gently in the wind. Like a stage for a spectacular play, the field was bordered with rows of white cages that were expertly made by Parisian artisans and decorated in rich royal blue. The playing grounds were surrounded by red fabric fences with blue ribbon on the edges, providing a colorful backdrop for the drama that was developing. With delicate hands, musicians stood prepared to perform scherzos and preludes, transporting the audience to a realm of beauty and suspense. Every aspect was meticulously prepared. There were far more bunnies than a few hundred, or perhaps a few. Aware of spectacle and psychological effects, Berthier insisted on precisely 3. Ling, a number that would test not just logistics but also everyone's spirits. To appeal to the eye and stimulate the intellect, the bunnies were grouped in 3 different breeds: earthy brown, soft gray, and spotless white. Who could have imagined that the seeds of a tragedy unlike any other would be sown by this meticulously planned demonstration of gentility and power? There had been underlying logistical problems from the start. The selected bunnies were house rabbits that had been raised comfortably and were used to being around people, well fed, often stroked, and soothed by the soft tones of harpsichord music in their pens. They had lived under false pretenses of safety. Their cages were made more for containment than for actual defense, even if they were secured with fences made of jagged iron. Though their keepers were unaware of it, these fences turned the rabbits into a concentrated infantry, their innate herd tendencies heightened rather than weakened. When invitations were sent out, each beautifully written in black, flowing ink on cream paper and signed with Napoleon's characteristic slanted signature, excitement shook the court. The language was formal but approachable. On June 30th, starting at 5 p.m., You are kindly invited to participate in a rabbit hunt at Min Na Meadow. Light-colored clothing is preferred. If you have a hunting rifle, please bring it. After the hunt, there will be wine and light fare. We look forward to your dignified arrival. This invitation's originality sparked interest and excitement. The emperor made an unusual and unique gesture by inviting people to pleasure rather than combat for the first time. Generals, nobility, and visitors were all giddy with anticipation as they pictured a serious scene in which Napoleon, cloaked and armed with a rifle, would practice the delicate art of hunting tiny rabbits. This mental picture combined humor and solemnity to create a vision that was both charming and royal. Berthier was unable to sleep and was restless as the hunt's eve drew near. His thoughts were racing with scenarios: rabbits running loose, hunting rifle misfires, visitors laughing at the show. But deep down, he comforted himself by thinking, power sometimes requires embellishment by games. Ultimately, the cages would open without a single shot being fired, leaving only the rabbits to tremble and sniff the new grass before starting a soft dance of liberation. Then, in the gentle warmth of the setting sun, the iron gate began to creak slowly open. The center of the meadow, where the light appeared to pool like liquid gold, caught everyone's attention. The velvety fur of the bunnies was ruffled by a light wind that blew through the grass, perhaps calling them to come closer. Only then did the most astute onlookers catch a glimpse of something more profound than the surface spectacle. This was not just a case of human entertainment, but rather a test of the bunny's own tacit military doctrine. Nobody knew what was going to happen yet. It was generally agreed that the plan was creative but risky, because occasionally, regardless of how skilled the gunman is, the herd behaves in a way that is uncontrollable. The following episode started when the soft-furred soldiers rose in silence. Berthier made the choice to increase the number of bunnies from a few hundred to an incredible 3,000, without fully considering the repercussions. His only goal was to create a show worthy of the emperor himself, one that would evoke wonder and joy among the court. The rabbits were carefully chosen house rabbits, collected from 7 separate farms located throughout the Ile-de-France area. Not wild animals caught from the forests. These farms were unusual in their own right. Their owners kept rabbits as beloved pets rather than food, and kids frequently took them to picnics and tennis matches. The condition of these rabbits was excellent. They were loaded gently into the waiting carriages, looking healthy and well-groomed, their coats shining in the gentle morning light. The soft notes of harpsichord music, a traditional tune thought to soothe and calm even the most apprehensive animals, floated through the barns and stables, lulling many to sleep. Select rabbits with good health and coats, capable of enduring 4 to 5 hours exposed to summer sun without distress, was one of the straightforward directives sent to those planning the hunt. Horse-drawn carriages started their slow trips toward the designated meadow as soon as the sun came up. Soldiers with hunting guns stood watch above each carriage, not to threaten the rabbits but to keep them from escaping while in transportation. The animals were given careful attention at prearranged rest stops. They were given barley, soft carrots, and fresh grass food selected to keep them relaxed and happy despite their brief confinement. Soft and delicate baby rabbits were held in the arms of caregivers and given gentle cuddles to ease their anxiety before being returned to their cages. These preparations took place in a serene, almost idyllic setting. Only those with a trained nose could detect the subtle, earthy smell of rabbit droppings that pervaded the air. Everyone involved was sure that when the cage's gates were unlocked, the rabbits would scatter everywhere, scared animals running from their captors, so that the hunters could marvel at their skill and celebrate their victory in front of the emperor. Beneath this calm exterior, however, lurked a crucial miscommunication, a deadly mistake that would shortly alter the trajectory of events. The house rabbit's natural herd instinct, which is sometimes undervalued, had been unintentionally triggered and heightened. In contrast to wild rabbits, which have a tendency to run wildly when threatened, these domesticated animals had adapted to the loudness and presence of people. They have no fear of unexpected movements or loud noises. Their defense strategy was to run into the center, where they anticipated protection, warmth, and food, rather than scatter. When the cage doors opened, imagine a mother rabbit, used to soft caresses and reassuring phrases, naturally running to the field's hottest, safest location. Her infants huddled safely in the center of the group, tacitly relying on the security that their numbers offered. The proud image of Napoleon standing erect under the sunset sun was the only thing that the 3,000 pairs of little, round brown eyes were focused on. The backup cops frantically tried to fortify the gates and manage the flow as the first wave of rabbits rushed ahead. However, it was too late. House rabbits always took the quickest route to well-known territory, since they had never acquired the evasive techniques of their wild counterparts. In this instance, the emperor himself served as the center of power, and that ground was the hunting arena's core. A loss of control resulted from what appeared to be a straightforward logistical problem. The organizers had overlooked the significant distinction between domesticated and wild animals. Rabbits may have been trained to run in circles or ovals to amuse guests or quiet crowds, but no one had taught them to flee when threatened. The rabbits saw this as a reunion with the person they connected with food and safety, not a threat at all. The hunters and guards had no idea what to anticipate. The rabbits would not flee if the first gunshot, if it occurred at all, scared them into running more quickly in the direction of the center's protection. With everyone's eyes on the emperor and their minds refusing to accept the impossible, nobody took anything to stop the anarchy from breaking out. As a result, the entire plan was reversed when the cages opened. The rabbits were no longer targets of hunts or prey. They turned into aggressors instead, flooding the field with a raging wave of soft fur and stomping feet. The combined pitter-patter of thousands of tiny feet caused the ground to tremble, forming a rushing tsunami that charged toward the emperor's seat of authority and the gathered entourage. The safe zone, behind crimson fabric gates. Nobles gazed in horrified stillness, their faces frozen in amazement and shock. "They're running toward your seat," were the only shocked mutterings that came out of their mouths. To avoid the approaching tide, a few courtiers hurried up onto benches, making room for the emperor to try to evacuate. A basic principle was brutally reaffirmed in that instant: never undervalue the opponent, regardless of how innocuous they seem. What had started out as a noble hunting expedition quickly devolved into a disorderly retreat. The softest, most resolute army Europe had ever seen was pursuing Napoleon relentlessly, making him the hunted rather than the hunter. The expansive meadow where the day's extraordinary combat was set to begin was illuminated by long, golden beams of light as the sun hung low in the late afternoon sky. Instead of running away, as one might anticipate from shy animals, the first battalion of rabbits charged forward with unexpected cohesion and energy. They advanced steadily and purposefully toward their prey, moving more like a coordinated furry wave than dispersed individuals. Napoleon hoisted his silver hunting rifle, which was mirror-shined and gleamed brilliantly in the last of the sun's rays. As he stood tall and composed, none of the astonishment that would soon engulf the audience was evident in his composed manner. He was accustomed to the tumult of battle, having fought fierce opponents on battlefields all around Europe. His unwavering determination and strategic acumen had brought down armies. This was different. Though, unfazed by the loud cries of gunfire that reverberated across the field, the rabbits appeared to find power in the noise. One especially brave rabbit sprang forward with remarkable speed. Dodging the initial shot with a quick turn, it jumped straight onto Napoleon's boot in a shocking display of boldness, its tiny claws clutching the leather as though to establish a claim. The assembled court echoed with gasps. The mood changed abruptly from assured expectation to confused incredulity. Guards hesitated, their hands shaking and their weapons poised. The idea of shooting rabbits, which are small, innocuous animals, went against their sense of decency and obligation. The emperor's own army of bunnies, however, scaled his legs and tenderly rubbed against his trousers while playfully nibbling at the embroidered edges of his coat. Behind his calm stare, Napoleon's visage hardened, a glimmer of annoyance visible. In an attempt to scatter the bold animals, he raised his rifle again and fired into the air, not with the intention of killing but rather to threaten. However, there were no evidence of fear or withdrawal from the bunnies. Instead, they swarmed their reward like a live, moving carpet of fur and movement, leaping and crawling with unrelenting determination. The soft battle thus started, a strange and perplexing encounter in which predator and prey merged into a frenzied dance of surprise and persistence. The emperor took a tentative step back, his shiny boot barely making contact with the soft ground as he attempted to keep his cool in the face of the mayhem that was taking on all around him. Then he took another step, slow and methodical, but with increasing urgency as the situation's reality set in. With unexpected persistence, bunnies clung to his legs and feet. Their brilliant eyes and twitching noses revealed a reckless resolve that defied reason. As their tiny claws gripped the seams of his trousers and the folds of his cloak, what had started out as a graceful hunt had now devolved into an unreal siege. Nearby attendants and aides yelled frantic, perplexed orders to bring order back. In desperate screams, they called for the band to stop playing, the guards to move, and the bunnies to be chased away. But in the midst of all this noise, chaos was king. The meticulously planned strategy fell apart like a delicate tapestry ripped by an invisible hand. In a flurry of glass breaking and metal clattering, tables that had been arranged with crystal and silverware for the post-hunt feast were flipped over in the chaos, their contents tumbling to the floor. Flags and banners that had formerly flown brightly in the pleasant breeze and were emblazoned with royal colors were trampled underfoot or ripped down by the hurried feet of courtiers trying to escape the oncoming tsunami of soft fur. However, the band, trapped in the middle of the uproar, kept playing, unsure of whether to stop or carry on, as though the mayhem were a meticulously planned aspect of the show. Their instruments produced discordant notes that served as the scene's eerie soundtrack. The cries to flee became more urgent, harsher, and louder across the meadow. The voices echoed together. Go back, for heaven's sake. Retreat. Even those who were too astonished to move heard the orders echoing across the wide open space. Carried by the wind, soldiers hurried to create protection lines and open a passage for the emperor's departure. While horses whinnied uneasily, feeling the tension, this surprise furry army surrounded Napoleon on all sides, forcing him to answer the summons and escape. The most improbable of adversaries now endangered the authority and dignity he had just moments before personified. He had no choice but to turn and jump into his waiting carriage. With a decisive thud, the wooden door behind him slammed shut, separating the surging rabble from the beleaguered emperor. However, the rabbits continued to hop in pursuit, unfazed by the abrupt containment. With its little paws scuffing against the glossy wood, One bold critter attempted to climb up the carriage step, perhaps supposing that there was a food supply concealed inside. Another clung to the wheel, its claws biting in as though to stop the carriage from escaping. With a strong crack of his whip, the driver propelled the horses ahead. As they thundered against the ground, their strong hooves sprayed dust into the air, swirling like a fog to mark the emperor's flight. Carrying Napoleon from the battlefield of soft fur and unwavering resolve, the carriage's wheels screeched and rattled as it rushed out. The pounding of hooves and the faint, panicked pat-pat-pat of hundreds upon dozens of jumping bunnies pursuing the fleeing prize were mixed with the cries of soldiers and aides. As the last of the rabbits gave one last jolt of speed before falling exhaustedly onto the grass, a dense cloud of dust billowed behind them, engulfing the tumultuous scene in its own tiny way. One especially fat rabbit was a warrior fulfilled. Lying stretched, with its chest heaving, the emperor breathed sharply and heavily inside the carriage as the realization of his retreat set in. An obstinate relic from the impossible combat barely survived. A single rabbit ear fluttered against the folds of his cloak. Tufts of soft fur were scattered on the shining floor, remnants of a struggle that no one had expected and no one wanted to recall. There was silence in the enclosed room. No words were exchanged because the embarrassment was too acute and the moment's gravity was too great. The carriage of an emperor, not victorious or unbeatable, but vanquished not by legions of troops or cannon fire, but by a legion of the most gentle, uncompromising enemies imaginable, was the only sound to break the silence. There was an unsettling air of chaos and discomfort in the previously magnificent hallways of the lavish palace. The graceful courtiers, who usually walked with assured elegance on the gleaming marble floors, suddenly exchanged sly looks and spoke to one another, their voices low and their strides tentative. The weight of the day's remarkable and humiliating occurrences seemed to undermine the court's majesty, which was so used to demonstrations of luxury and authority. Nobody dared to publicly address the emperor's humiliating retreat because it was inconceivable to admit in public that Napoleon, the unstoppable conqueror, had been forced from the field by a swarm of bunnies. The story, however, could not be contained and ran discreetly through the hallways, like a dirty secret that should not be revealed in public. The royal scribes were careful not to indicate defeat in their official announcements. Rather, vague and euphemistic terminology was used to describe the incident. A phenomenon completely beyond human control had taken place. An unexpected natural event. These intentionally ambiguous terms were used to conceal the reality while preserving the image of authority and order. A number of urgent meetings between the emperor's closest advisors, ministers, and courtiers were held behind closed doors. Damage control was the main focus, along with how to maintain the emperor's dignity in the face of such an unparalleled embarrassment, reassure both allies and subjects, and influence public opinion. Techniques included commissioned academic studies that would present the rabbit's behavior as an uncommon biological oddity and controlled dissemination of false information. In the meantime, satire and subtle ridicule flourished among artists and poets in the dim corners of salons and literary events. While formal statements maintained the throne's dignity, private discussions and artistic creations subtly mocked the event. Verse that wove in humor and criticism into the fabric of high society circulated, and covert prints featured caricatures of the emperor drowning in a sea of fluffy rabbits. The story infiltrated Paris's collective consciousness, in spite of official efforts to censor it. The rabbit ambush was a humiliating secret that was turned into a legendary story by whispers in homes, pubs, and marketplaces. It came to represent not just an odd incident, but also the frailty of authority, a reminder that even the most powerful can be overthrown by the tiniest of foes. the story eventually took on a life of its own, becoming more vivid and detailed with each telling. Its core preserved in the city's mythology, a timeless legend that reverberated well beyond the palace's gates. The image of the great Napoleon being driven into a humiliating retreat by a soft-furred legion served as a warning and a source of sarcastic humor for years. On that strange day, Napoleon Bonaparte, praised as unbeatable and indestructible on the wide and cruel battlefields of Europe, had to learn a lesson unlike any he had ever experienced in the heat of combat. It was a lesson taught by the silent, unrelenting resolve of being so little and seemingly unimportant that no one could have predicted their ability to oppose an emperor. Rather than by the thunder of cannons, the clash of swords, or the strategic moves of rival armies, he came to terms with the harsh fact that authority was not absolute. It wasn't an inflexible power that could make anything do what it wanted. The unpredictable nature of nature and the surprising strategies of the soft enemy might degrade even the most powerful commander, the most experienced general, and the most dreaded sovereign. The emperor faced a reality that had an impact much beyond the meadow's limits that day. As rabbits swarmed the hunting field with unexpected intensity, the tiniest organisms, who are sometimes disregarded and undervalued, possess a unique power that can cause disruption, confusion, and ultimately victory. The seriousness of this discovery changed how future hunt preparations were handled in the days and weeks that followed. A number of new strategies were put into place by the court's experts and the hunting organizers in order to stop such a degrading incident from happening again. The hunting grounds were surrounded by robust fences made of materials that would not only survive the unrelenting tenacity of rabbits, but also the unintentional mayhem that comes with massive animal groups. Guards had specialized training designed to address the soft enemy. They discovered how to predict rabbit herd behavior and control their movements using strategy and patience instead of force. Control and foresight were emphasized as the strategy changed from overwhelming dominance to cautious containment. Additionally, there were significantly fewer rabbits to be released. Smaller, easier to manage groups were planned to arrive at different times, rather than saturating the field with thousands of animals all at once. In order to preserve the emperor's dignity and the hunt's order, this new tactic sought to preserve the spectacle's grandeur. Napoleon himself became much more circumspect. The humiliating event dimmed the confidence that had once carried him unopposed through innumerable campaigns. He now walked with measured caution, always aware of the lessons he had learned by the day the bunnies rose. Instead of approaching the field with the confident swagger of a conqueror, however, this prudence was not a result of weakness or fear. Rather, it was the mark of a leader who had matured, a leader who understood that genuine strength is not just shown by power or triumph, but also by flexibility, modesty, and the readiness to absorb knowledge from even the most surprising of opponents. This acquired knowledge influenced the emperor's leadership and administration style more broadly, as well as the hunt's. It gave him a keen understanding that authority is ephemeral and contingent, susceptible to both visible and invisible factors, and that upholding it calls for alertness, deference to complexity, and flexibility. As Napoleon gained humility and experience, this lesson eventually became a pillar of his legacy, demonstrating his ability to not only conquer territories, but also to conquer himself. Once believed to be unassailable, the emperor had been trained by the most insignificant adversaries, and he came out of that education enlightened rather than degraded. The emperor's carriage made a melancholy journey through the dying light of darkness as it traveled gently back toward the palace, following the disorganized and confusing retreat from the meadow. This journey was shrouded in a silence that was far deeper and more profound than the thunderous cacophony of artillery and marching boots that usually accompanied his triumphant returns. The silence seemed to weigh down the very air itself. Thicker than the smoke of battle, and heavier than the loudest cannonade ever unleashed. There was an unnerving silence in the air within the luxurious carriage. Normally brave and unwavering in their loyalty, courtiers and guards now purposefully avoided looking into their leader's eyes. The air was heavy with embarrassment, a burden that was unspoken but shared by everyone who had seen the day's unexplained and degrading occurrences. The mild, musky smell of fur mixed with the smell of crushed grass, which had been trodden and flattened under the boots of millions of tiny bunnies, and clung obstinately to the upholstery. It remained as an aromatic echo of the day's peculiar and extraordinary struggle. Testament. As soon as the carriage doors closed behind him, Napoleon sat by himself in his private apartments. The beautiful tapestries and elaborate walls were covered with long, swaying shadows from the flickering candlelight, which danced like ghosts, whispering of past glory and upcoming reckonings. His thoughts strayed through the halls of recollection, the weight of loneliness pressing down on him as he thought about battles waged with ferocity and ingenuity, countries taken decisively, and empires brought to heel under the French flag. However, in spite of these enormous accomplishments, his thoughts were now uncomfortably focused on a much more modest and fantastical scene. A humiliating ambush by thousands of soft, defenseless bunnies rather than by armored foes brandishing war weapons. A tiny brass button bearing the imperial crest, which was formerly a sign that inspired reverence, dread, and awe in both countries and on battlefields, was firmly grasped in his hand. It now functioned as a harsh and unforgiving reminder of his own frailty and the transient nature of authority. It served as a tangible reminder of the worst lesson of the day, that even the most powerful and esteemed individuals can be humbled by the smallest of enemies, regardless of their size or strength. As his fingers twisted around the chilly metal, he came to a deep realization. Power was not an impregnable stronghold that could withstand any danger. It was a precarious equilibrium that was continually put to the test by invisible and visible forces. With their surprise attack, the rabbits had destroyed the emperor's sense of invincibility, as well as the appearance of total control. Napoleon faced the sobering reality that leadership is as much about enduring defeat as it is about commanding triumph in this silent room. Away from the din of battlegrounds and the cheers of audiences, the day had revealed a weakness in his legacy. But it also presented an opportunity to become wiser, to temper ambition with humility, and to accept the uncertain intricacies of life. As though reflecting his inner struggle, the shadows flickered once more. A tapestry of experiences that would define not only the man, but also the king he hoped to be, was woven together by memories of victories and the stinging sting of failure. No award would honor a retreat before a sea of fur and small paws, and no historian would record this occasion in huge books of grandeur. However, the lesson was genuine, lasting, and life-changing. Napoleon's eyes ascended to the fading flame on the table in front of him. A single light among the surrounding shadows, like his own resolve, which was unsure but unwavering. The light shook. He was aware that this moment would stick with him forever, serving as a sobering reminder that even the strongest people must submit to the unanticipated forces that make history. Even if only momentarily, there was an almost tangible tension in the palace's gilded and elaborate hallways, where marble columns rose toward elaborately painted ceilings and tapestries portrayed heroic wars of the past. The royal court's normally lively rooms were now subdued, with whispered discussions interspersed with the odd repressed sigh or anxious look. The lavish surrounds, which were adorned with velvet and gold leaf, appeared to hold their breath, as though they were anticipating what would happen. The court held an emergency session in reaction to the embarrassing and unprecedented incident that had occurred in the meadow, where a seemingly harmless crowd of rabbits forced the emperor to escape. In austere chambers, ministers, advisors, and aristocrats assembled, their features marked with worry and the burden of accountability. Even so, nobody dared to publicly discuss the emperor's shameful retreat from what the public would later refer to as the soft enemy, despite the seriousness of the situation. Rather, there was a tacit knowledge of the scandal that had transpired behind closed doors, a common, quiet admission that pervaded the atmosphere. The gears of political scheming started turning quickly. Every phrase in official declarations was carefully considered and calibrated to prevent further humiliation while preserving a sense of dignity. Instead of being characterized as a loss or a defeat, the event was characterized as a unique biological phenomenon, a remarkable and unexpected increase in the local rabbit population that had overpowered even the most well-prepared hunters. The court commissioned the most eminent naturalists and scholars of the day to write reports and treatises in order to support this story. The purpose of these documents, which were full of scientific language and meticulous observations, was to give the explanation authority and credibility. Instead of presenting the events of the day as a failure of imperial leadership or military planning, they presented them as an act of nature, a rare and uncontrollable force. These well-crafted remarks were circulated throughout the capital and beyond by the press, which was strictly regulated by the court. Newspapers and pamphlets published articles that presented the incident in the emperor's best possible light. Any critical thoughts, satirical remarks, or rumors that might have challenged the official line were quickly and methodically put down. Censors made sure that public conversation stayed civil and in line with the monarchy's objectives. However, the human spirit proved robust in spite of these attempts at concealment and control. The sly satire of artists, poets, and playwrights flourished behind the velvet curtains and gilded doors of exclusive salons and exclusive literary circles. They created poetry and cartoons that mocked the emperor's humiliating retreat with sardonic humor and subtle allusions. A rising fascination with the event was stoked by these artistic expressions, which were surreptitiously shared among the literati and nobility. This fascination was flavored with comedy and was also emphasized by a deep-seated concern about the fragility of authority. What had started out as hushed rumors developed into something far more permanent over time. The story of the ambush of the rabbit moved from outrage to folklore. It became a cautionary tale that was passed down through the generations, reminding everyone who heard it that even the greatest men are susceptible to the whims of fate and the erratic elements of nature that have the power to ruin even the best-laid plans. The story's evolution from a political liability to a work of cultural lore illustrated the intricate connection between perception and power. The people reclaimed the story in their own way, adding humor, empathy, and a dash of poetic justice to the occurrence, while the court tried to keep hold of it. Ultimately, the rabbit ambush evolved from a story of humiliation to a representation of humility, fortitude, and the frequently erratic interplay between power and nature. Napoleon was alone in his study, surrounded by the weighty books that detailed his rise to power and the artifacts of previous campaigns. When he fell into a reflective calm, candlelight flickered softly over the walls, illuminating the stacks of carefully preserved maps and messages that attested to his military prowess and the enormous lands he had seized. But this night, his thoughts strayed far from the well-known calculations of political ploys and war plans. Rather, his mind drifted to a surprising teacher, the unassuming bunny. No military triumph could compare to the lesson this little, inconspicuous creature had taught, whose very presence had caused a devastating setback. It was a lesson on the real meaning of leadership that went beyond the limited scope of military command. Napoleon understood that being a leader involved more than just commanding troops and winning battles. True leadership required something far more profound: the ability to adjust to unexpected and unforgiving difficulties, and the grace to bear humiliation without losing dignity. It necessitated a humility that many great men found difficult to accept, an understanding that power, however absolute it may appear, was essentially brittle and dependent. Any sense of invincibility had been shattered by the day's events, which revealed the weaknesses that even the most powerful monarchs could not overcome. However, this exposure also presented an opportunity to develop, change, and overcome hardship. Napoleon made the silent but determined decision to turn this humiliating incident into a source of strength. He saw that a leader's accomplishments, conquests, and empires were not the only things that characterized their character. Equally, if not more significantly, it was influenced by how they handled adversity, how they accepted failure, and what they learned from these experiences. Napoleon swore to live up to these ideals in the silence of his room, among the flickering shadows and the murmur of candlelight. Once a source of embarrassment, the rabbit ambush would now serve as a reminder of the fortitude needed to lead, the humility needed to mature, and the bravery needed to confront life's unforeseen obstacles head-on. This contemplation signaled a sea change in not just his own life but also in the fundamentals of leadership in general, leaving a legacy that would reverberate well beyond France's boundaries and the pages of history. The atmosphere in the imperial court changed significantly following the humbling experience with the unrelenting flood of rabbits. What had been a chaotic and unexpectedly defeating day became a time of deep introspection and reorientation. The lessons learned from the unexpected attack by the soft adversary led to a thorough review of the tactics guiding not only the hunts but also the more general concepts of readiness and leadership. Future hunt preparations were made with a newfound vigor and caution that had never been seen before. Measured, strategic planning replaced the careless approach of overwhelming numbers and presumed dominance. First and foremost, the quantity of rabbits that were to be released into the meadow was drastically decreased, down from the daunting thousands to a controllable, observable, and predictable force. Additionally, physical measures were significantly enhanced. The hunting grounds were surrounded by sturdy fencing made of reinforced materials that could withstand the rabbits' remarkable strength and unwavering perseverance. To be sure, the breach from the day before wouldn't happen again. These barriers were carefully examined and tested in order to contain the soft-furred enemies without needless suffering. The perimeter was enlarged and strengthened with layers of deterrence. Equal attention was paid to human factors, in addition to the physical protections. The guards and attendants assigned to supervise the hunts received specialized training designed to address the particular difficulties presented by the soft enemy. They learned to forecast the motions and instincts of the herd by studying the erratic patterns of rabbit behavior. This training instilled a knowledge that control over such creatures requires subtlety and respect, emphasizing patience, observation, and gentle direction. Instead of using force, the operation was scrutinized down to the last detail. Contingency plans were created to handle a variety of possible situations, from the scheduling of rabbit releases to the placement of hunters and the cooperation of various parties. Regular exercises and simulations helped the squad be ready for unforeseen events and ensured that future hunts would go successfully while maintaining the emperor's authority and dignity. Napoleon himself actively and personally followed these developments. He welcomed the event as a crucial teaching opportunity rather than writing it off as a simple humiliation to be forgotten. He believed that the lessons went well beyond the hunt's confines. They addressed the core of leadership and governance, emphasizing the need for flexibility, vision, and humility. He understood that, although necessary, power and courage were not enough on their own. Maintaining power and attaining long-term success required the capacity to predict change, plan for the unexpected, and react adaptably. This realization influenced not only the hunt's tactical elements, but also his larger plan for establishing dominance and an empire. With the implementation of these new procedures, the court's confidence gradually recovered. Both his advisors and his citizens were cautiously optimistic about the emperor's new strategy. The hunt had evolved from a simple show of power to a representation of intelligent leadership that recognized its limitations and pursued ongoing development. During his quiet times of introspection, Napoleon realized that this development, which came from the unexpected mentor of a cuddly enemy, would influence not just his rule, but also the legacy he left behind. Once a source of embarrassment, the episode now served as evidence of the fortitude and discernment that characterize real power. It was not long before news of the notorious rabbit ambush spread beyond the palace's elaborate walls. It carried with it a weird mixture of skepticism and jovial incredulity, seeping through the magnificent gates and onto the busy streets of Paris like a sluggish, persistent trickle. It was nearly impossible to accept that a seemingly innocuous horde of soft-furred creatures had driven the powerful Napoleon, a man whose name inspired awe and whose presence sparked fear throughout Europe, into retreat. But the story continued, reverberated in taverns, whispered in the salons where the city's elite congregated, and whispered in dark corners. The response was very different, but no less strong. Within the palace itself, there was now a noticeable tension in the gilded rooms, which were adorned with tapestries, gilded mirrors, and crystal chandeliers. Courtiers were attracted into whispered discussions because they were used to handling the complex dances of power with practiced ease. As voices fell to conspiratorial whispers and faces turned away from curious ears, groups swiftly came and went. Some looked at one another with sympathy, quietly recognizing the difficult situation. Others wore knowing, ironic smiles, their laughter well concealed below layers of prudence and formality. Once an impregnable bastion of power, the emperor's dignity now seemed brittle and exposed. However, those closest to power were more concerned with the emperor's potential for victory and resiliency than they were with the actual fall. This ability to bounce back from humiliation, regain authority, and inspire loyalty in the face of adversity would ultimately define Napoleon's lasting legacy. Ever watchful and taciturn, the servants dared not mention the incident. The strictures of palace procedure and their implicit awareness of the seriousness of the situation were reflected in their silence. However, there was an unsaid recognition in the air of the palace itself, a collective awareness of the extraordinary and perhaps ridiculous turn of events that had taken place beneath the empire's roof. In the enormous halls, there was still a little smell of crushed grass, which had been trodden and flattened by innumerable tiny paws, caught in the folds of heavy draperies and tucked away in the elaborate embroidery of ceremonial clothes. It blended with the faint hint of fur. As silent witnesses, these sensory relics were woven into the palace's structure as a memory of the day when power's strength faced its most unexpected and gentlest foe. The story developed a life of its own within these walls over the course of the following days, whispered with a range of tones, including skepticism, laughter, and cautious contemplation. The rabbit ambush, which at first caused shock and controversy, progressively merged into the intricate fabric of court life and called into question the ideas of invincibility that had long characterized the emperor's rule. The strange occurrence inspired poets and musicians in the salons. Words and poems that praised fortitude and modesty from the perspective of the soft-furred enemy spread. Shrouded in metaphor and humor, artists drew subtle caricatures, their ink encapsulating the ridiculousness of a conflict waged with the resolute perseverance of thousands of hopping rabbits rather than muskets. Even though these statements were mostly kept confidential, Their impact was felt outside the court, influencing people's opinions both inside and outside of it. The event evolved into a significant cultural event rather than just a historical anecdote, demonstrating the erratic nature of power and the tenacity of the human spirit. The Royal Press Corps acted swiftly and purposefully to take control of the story of the notorious rabbit incident in response to mounting public interest and the possible danger of harmful rumors. A lot of euphemism language was used in official communiques because of the delicate nature of the situation and the need to protect the emperor's reputation. The incident was presented as a unique biological phenomenon rather than a defeat or failure, and was ascribed to an unanticipated and extraordinary increase in the local rabbit population, a natural occurrence that no human approach could have predicted or stopped. The court called in distinguished academics, naturalists, and animal behavior specialists to support the validity of this well-crafted reasoning. These esteemed individuals were asked to write in-depth analyses and scholarly publications that placed the occurrence in the larger context of animal dynamics, the unpredictability of animal herds, the infrequency of such widespread surges, and the limitations of human attempts to manipulate natural forces were all highlighted in their works. This intellectual intervention accomplished two goals. It gave the official narrative an air of authoritative authority and purposefully diverted public attention from the emperor's tactical withdrawal by presenting the incident as an unusual and unavoidable act of nature. Distribution of these assertions was carried out with accuracy. The official story was widely disseminated across Paris and the empire by the press, which was strictly controlled by censorship boards and court officials. Instead of portraying the occurrence as a humiliating failure, newspapers and pamphlets mimicked the language of controlled humility and scientific impartiality, portraying it as an intriguing but uncontrollable incident. Any attempts at criticism, satire, or mocking were quickly detected and put down, guaranteeing that public conversation stayed civil, measured, and supportive of the imperial image. Nevertheless, the human spirit's inclination for irreverence and storytelling found outlets in spite of these strict attempts to control and mold the tale. Poets, playwrights, and caricaturists welcomed the incident as a rich source of subtly humorous and satirical expression in secret salons, private parties, and the city's artistic circles. Discreetly, caricatures of the emperor being overtaken by a wave of fluffy rabbits started to circulate. Their scathing humor was subtle enough to avoid outright banning, but obvious enough to elicit knowing laughter. The emperor's shameful retreat was interwoven with allegories of power, humility, and fate in these clever, witty, and occasionally moving poetic lyrics that circulated in manuscript form. These covert cultural manifestations contributed to the covert but widespread public interest in the affair. Once suppressed and cleansed by official channels, the story flourished in the shadows, spreading from bar to theater, from mouth to mouth, and gradually establishing itself in the public's collective consciousness. The narrative moved beyond its immediate scandalous beginnings and took on the status of legend. As the weeks stretched into months, it evolved from a humiliating anecdote or a whispered joke to a symbol, a timeless tale that shows that even the strongest of men are susceptible to the whims of nature and the whims of fate. It acted as a warning that despite its majesty and apparent invincibility, power is ultimately brittle and exposed. This event's transition from scandal to myth was not exclusive. Rather, it was a reflection of a larger cultural trend that turns failure or moments of weakness into stories about resiliency, comedy, and compassion. Napoleon's rabbit trap became a mirror held up to the empire itself, illustrating the intricacies of power, the need for humility, and the forever changing dance between man and the forces that determine his fate. The rabbit ambush became immortal through literature, art, and oral tradition. It was told in whispered stories by fireplaces, acted out on stage, and captured in drawings that compared the gentle, resolute faces of rabbits with imperial garb. Once causing fear and shame, the incident developed into a rich cultural touchstone that evoked wonder, amusement, and introspection long after the final rabbit had left the area. Napoleon sat by himself in the silent seclusion of his own study, his form illuminated by the gentle flickering light of a candle. The dancing flames' lengthy shadows extended across the walls, creating uncanny patterns on the many maps, papers, and dispatches that detailed the extensive reach of his military expeditions and victorious conquests. The chamber seemed to pulse with the memory of battles waged and won, kingdoms captured, and empires humbled beneath his unwavering resolve, everything resonating with the echoes of past triumphs and the heavy weight of ambition. However, the emperor's thoughts on this specific evening were very different from the well-known world of strategy and conquest. Rather, his mind struggled with an unusual and surprising teacher, the unassuming bunnies that had so completely upended his well-planned hunt. Consequently, his sense of invincibility. These tiny beings, inconsequential in the vast arena of conflict, had taught a lesson that went beyond simple combat strategy. Napoleon saw, with a clarity that came from introspection, that real leadership went much beyond simply leading armies or winning battles. It required something much more profound: the fortitude to meet hardship head on without failing, the grace to bear humiliation with dignity, and the discernment to quickly adjust to unanticipated obstacles that no amount of planning could predict. Despite being extremely embarrassing and unheard of, this occurrence had revealed the weaknesses that even the most powerful leaders have. It served as a sobering reminder that even the most powerful leaders must deal with forces outside of their control, and that authority, no matter how enormous, is not always reliable. Napoleon made the decision to turn this traumatic event into a source of fortitude and development, rather than giving in to hopelessness or rage. In order to demonstrate that a leader's character is not only determined by the glories of triumphs, but also by the bravery with which he faces defeat, the humility with which he accepts it, and the determination to develop and learn from it, he pledged to live up to the resilience that true leadership requires. Napoleon's resolve solidified as the lighting flickered, illuminating the strewn papers and the brass buttons of his uniform. Even though it was embarrassing, he realized that this moment may act as a crucible, creating a stronger will instead of a weaker one. He thought that a leader's success is simply one aspect of his character. Another is how he gets back up after failing. Napoleon accepted the contradiction of vulnerability and power in the silence of that room. Surrounded by the specters of bygone splendors and the uncertainties of the future, he realized that real greatness is about striking a balance between ambition and acceptance, control and surrender, and power and humility. And he discovered a new kind of strength in that acceptance. Following the humiliating experience of the recent hunt, the imperial court was forced to reconsider and change how it handled such situations. The humiliation that had transpired in the meadow was not just a brief episode of bad luck. It was a stark reminder that the difficulties presented by the gentle but surprisingly powerful enemies required a more deliberate, methodical, and strategic response. With a renewed feeling of caution and a focus on careful planning, preparations were made for future excursions. The days of complacency, when success was assured by mere numbers and bluster, were long gone. Rather, the hunt's organizers adopted a strategy based on caution and accuracy. The choice to carefully restrict the quantity of rabbits released into the hunting grounds was essential to this change. The numbers were drastically reduced from the overwhelming flood of thousands to a manageable cohort that could be watched over and managed without running the risk of causing anarchy. This reduction was more than just a practical change. It was a basic realization that, when dealing with such an unpredictable force, quality and control were more important than quantity. The physical preparations were just as demanding. Strong fencing was put up along the meadow's edge, made of reinforced materials that were especially made to resist the rabbits' tenacious efforts. Lessons learnt from the last breach were used in the design of these barriers, which were inspected frequently and strengthened as needed, creating a safe and confined setting that would stop any unexpected surges from crossing the lines and ruining the event was the obvious goal. However, the human factor was arguably the most important. Specialized training programs designed to address the unique characteristics of the soft enemy were provided to guards and attendants tasked with overseeing the hunt. Understanding the rabbits' erratic behavior, including their flight patterns, herd instincts, and stimulus responses, was the main goal of these sessions. The trainees acquired skills in calmly handling unforeseen events, anticipating motions instead of using force, and soft containment. This instruction emphasized the value of patience and strategic thinking, while cultivating a profound respect for the enemy. Every aspect of the operation was carefully examined. The rabbit releases were timed to avoid overcrowding the field at once, with staggered intervals intended to keep things in order. Hunters and support staff were positioned to provide optimal coverage and quick reaction, to guarantee that the Emperor's authority and dignity would always be maintained. Contingency plans were prepared for a range of situations, including unexpected surges and equipment malfunctions. Napoleon personally and actively participated in the supervision of these measures. He welcomed the occurrence as a valuable lesson, with implications that went far beyond the boundaries of the hunting grounds. Rather than distance himself from what many might have written off as a small embarrassment, he recognized that flexibility, foresight, and humility were essential elements of good leadership and governance, not just qualities to be preached. Napoleon stressed in meetings with his advisors the importance of having the guts to face unexpected obstacles head-on and the ability to learn from mistakes. His emphasis went beyond the hunt's immediate practicality to include a more comprehensive leadership philosophy that emphasized adaptability as much as power and caution. In addition to ambition, the court and the entire empire were affected by this change in strategy. It signaled the start of a new era in which knowledge restrained power, and even the tiniest enemies demanded deference and careful planning. Once a source of embarrassment, the rabbit ambush had transformed into a growth-promoting event and an improbable instructor that had changed not just a hunting custom, but also the fundamentals of leadership. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, and the once shocking event that had seen the powerful emperor chased from the field by an apparently endless horde of rabbits started to fade from immediate scandal and enter the realm of collective memory, gradually becoming a story that was told in the busy city of Paris with a blend of humor, affection, and reverence. In the eyes of the common people, what had formerly been a source of hushed derision and repressed shame behind the palace walls was now a tale of warmth and humor. The episode became a creative springboard for both street entertainers and itinerant poets. They wrote songs and created plays that celebrated the great Napoleon's surprising modesty. Despite his greatness and strength, the gentlest of enemies had brought him low. These widely accepted versions took on a life of their own, giving the affair a light-hearted tone that softened the scandal's sharp edges and transformed it into a symbol of vulnerability. A universal human truth. The story struck a chord because it addressed a universal experience, the understanding that beneath the opulent exterior of power and the commanding presence of rulers, there were men just like everyone else who were prone to foolishness, fear, and unexpected reversals. This story gave the common people a surprising way to interact with their ruler. It spanned the gap between the common person strolling down the cobblestone streets and the crowned emperor on his throne. They were reminded by the story that grandeur and strength did not make one impervious to the fanciful turns of events or the modest teachings of nature. The number and variety of retellings of the story increased over time. It acquired the characteristics of folklore as it was passed down through the generations, evolving into a dynamic story that changed according to its audience and time. Even if the specifics might change with each retelling, the quantity of rabbits increasing, the pursuit becoming more spectacular, the emperor's predicament becoming more poignant. The fundamental lesson stayed the same: humility in the face of hardship, perseverance in the face of failure. From a historical anecdote to a cultural landmark, the rabbit ambush transcended its historical context and became ingrained in popular culture. It was both a sobering and a warning story, demonstrating that greatness entails having the fortitude to fail gracefully and the grace to get back up after failing. The narrative was told and retold in both calm village squares and busy marketplaces, evoking contemplation, humor, and a sense of humanity. The story of the emperor and his soft-furred opponents persisted in captivating and educating people through art, music, and oral tradition. Its lessons were as applicable to the citizens of Paris as they were to the kings who lived among them. What started out as an apparently insignificant hunting accident quickly moved beyond its original setting to become a significant and enduring cultural icon. Once thought to be nothing more than small animals and unimportant prey, rabbits ended up representing much more than their modest beginnings indicated. They developed into potent metaphors, signifying the erratic character of existence in general, and the innate constraints that even the most spectacular demonstrations of power eventually have to deal with. As a result of this metamorphosis, rabbits became a symbol of humility, a gentle reminder that no amount of power or might can ensure complete control over the complexity of the world. Their tenacity in the face of adversity symbolized the fortitude needed to meet life's unexpected hardships, while their abrupt and erratic actions demonstrated the unpredictable whims of fate that can abruptly change the path of history. This complex symbolism was immortalized in large part through the arts. The gentle, innocent shapes of rabbits were contrasted with the grandeur of imperial regalia, including shining crowns, scepters, and towering thrones. In captivating paintings by painters, these pictures invited viewers to consider the contradictory relationship between strength and fragility by capturing the sharp contrast between human ambition and inherent frailty. Poets also incorporated the story into their poetry, examining the complex relationship between strength and vulnerability. They explored the contradictions of human life through metaphor and allegory, writing lines that addressed the majesty of leadership as well as the humility required by its responsibilities. Their writing struck a chord with viewers who recognized parallels between the narrative and their own hardships and victories. The story was also adopted by the theater industry, which produced shows that combined humor and moving drama to make the chase come to life. The tension and final turn of events that characterized the event were dramatized by actors who played the parts of hunter and hunted. In addition to providing entertainment, these performances prompted reflection on the nature of fate, authority, and resiliency. This timeless symbolism made sure that the rabbit ambush tale would always be vivid and alive in society's collective memory. It turned into a live example of the intricate balancing act between human ambition and the erratic forces of nature, as well as between authority and humility. Once only used as toys, the bunnies became timeless symbols of the lessons learned, including those about tolerance, respect, and embracing life's inherent uncertainties. This rich cultural heritage persisted in shaping perceptions of leadership and power across time. It promoted a more complex perspective that accepted the humility needed to persevere and grow as well as the strength needed to lead through its creative and symbolic manifestations, the story turned into a beacon, a guiding narrative that served as a reminder to everyone who heard it that vulnerability is an essential component of greatness. In this sense, the common rabbits rose above their status as merely field animals and entered the world of popular mythology. Their legacy lives on as a timeless symbol of the human journey through perseverance, adversity, and the ability to embrace the unexpected. The rabbit ambush left a lasting impression on succeeding generations, influencing their cultural and historical awareness much beyond Napoleon's rule. This strange and funny story, which at first looked almost too unbelievable to be real, turned into a powerful warning on the nature of power, humility, and humanity. This story was told again over the ages, not only for its humorous value, but also as a profoundly wise lesson. It became a point of reference in leadership-related philosophical discussions and arguments, reminding both citizens and rulers that no one is genuinely indestructible, no matter how powerful they may be. The story served as a reminder that even people who appear to have unquestionable power are vulnerable to the capricious forces of nature and fate. The narrative coexisted with more traditional historical truths in classrooms and scholarly circles. In addition to being taught as a historical event, it was also taught as a timeless tale that emphasized the values of self-control and respect. It emphasized the value of respect for the natural world and the understanding that, despite our might, we are still a part of a wider ecosystem that is subject to uncontrollable forces. By reminding pupils that wisdom frequently emerges from the most unexpected and humble events, educators utilized the story to impart lessons in humility and caution. The narrative provided a powerful example of the boundaries of human power and the need to adjust to situations with poise and foresight. The story of the emperor and his soft-furred enemies spread beyond the confines of academics and into the wider cultural imagination. The story was used by philosophers, writers, and artists to examine themes of resiliency and vulnerability. The bunnies came to represent the erratic force that may arise from the smallest of causes, not weakness. This lasting influence persisted into political discourse, where the tale was cited as a warning against arrogance and overconfidence, sometimes directly and other times metaphorically. Leaders were reminded that in addition to strength, leadership requires humility to face uncertainty and adaptability to deal with unforeseen obstacles. As a result, the rabbit ambush evolved from its beginnings as a historical curiosity to become a timeless lesson that has been remembered for generations. It demonstrated that although power is great, it is not absolute, and that true leadership includes the ability to face failure with dignity and to draw lessons from the unexpected. The episode has therefore permanently altered human perception, demonstrating the timeless tension between order and disorder, power and modesty, aspiration and acceptance. Following the last tragic hunt, which had not only damaged the court's reputation, but also jeopardized the emperor's own honor, the palace government initiated a thorough set of measures to guarantee that such a disaster would never happen again. The lessons learned from the severe embarrassment were unmistakable. The soft enemy could no longer be disregarded or handled complacently. The court sought the advice of experts knowledgeable in animal behavior and containment techniques because it recognized the special and unexpected difficulty presented by the seemingly harmless but surprisingly tenacious rabbits. These professionals were entrusted with supervising the careful handling of the bunnies, turning the previously disorderly situation into a well-organized and regulated occasion. The hunting ground's physical defenses were greatly improved. Iron and reinforced wood, stronger, more resilient materials made, especially to endure the tenacious efforts of the rabbit herds, which had turned out to be more formidable than anybody had predicted, were used to rebuild the fencing that surrounded the meadow. The new barriers were designed fortifications meant to uphold order and stop any breach that may jeopardize the emperor's power. They were more than just fences. These physical advancements were accompanied by an equally rigorous approach to the human element. The attendants and guards assigned to oversee the hunt received extensive and specialized training. Beyond the use of force or weapons, their teaching placed a strong emphasis on comprehending the complex behaviors and herd instincts of rabbits. They learned to anticipate the creature's movements, to gently but efficiently guide and contain them, and to remain composed in the face of uncertainty. This new strategy prioritized strategy above raw force and promoted respect for the enemy. To further control the event, a series of new procedures was created in order to monitor and control the rabbits without running the risk of overcrowding the field. Restrictions were put on how many rabbits may be released at any one moment. In order to avoid the kind of rushing mayhem that had characterized the last hunt, staggered release periods were also implemented, separating the rabbits' entrance into the hunting fields. Napoleon himself actively and personally supported these measures. Instead of removing himself from the situation, he worked closely with the experts and his advisors, supervising exercises and going over all the new ideas in detail. His strategic thinking and acute vision aimed to foresee every scenario, leaving nothing to chance. A significant change in approach was signaled by these new preparations. The prior arrogance and sense of power had vanished. It was replaced by a careful regard for the uncertain forces at work, an understanding that even the smallest enemies might wield enormous influence, and an understanding that humility and flexibility were necessary for effective leadership. This change in strategy was in line with the emperor's larger worldview, which emphasized not just bravery and strength, but also caution, foresight, and the capacity to grow from unforeseen difficulties. Once a straightforward demonstration of strength, the hunt has evolved into a sophisticated test of self-control and deference. The court's trust was progressively rebuilt as the preparations advanced. After learning from the past, a more regulated and respectable performance was anticipated in the future. As a result of this change, the narrative of the soft opponent was no longer merely a warning, but rather an example of the fortitude and insight that characterize long-lasting leadership. The second hunt's day broke under skies full of expectation and a subdued anxiety that seemed to pervade the palace and the neighboring areas. A sober awareness of the difficulties that awaited them took the place of the careless assurance that had characterized the first expedition. Now properly groomed and protected with strengthened fencing, the meadow awaited the emperor and his entourage. Once a place of chaos and sudden retreat, the landscape had been turned into a controlled and well-organized arena. The harsh lessons learned from the previous encounter led to a deliberate decision to reduce the number of rabbits to be released. Nevertheless, these animals maintained their lively temperament in spite of their diminished numbers. They were less likely to overrun the field at once when released in small, well-timed batches, which helped the hunters and guards keep things under control. Napoleon's approach to the hunting fields was a blend of measured confidence and cautious resolve. He kept thinking about his past, humiliating loss, which served as a continual reminder to exercise caution and thoughtful planning. Beneath that prudence, however, was the undeniable spark of his innate leadership, which motivated him to regain control of the circumstance and exhibit command even in the face of uncertainty. The guards moved with a controlled and honed efficiency as the hunt got underway. They had developed predictive motions via intense training and experience, rather than reactionary ones. They carefully and precisely corralled and contained the soft enemies by leading the bunnies along predetermined routes. The animals responded with increased awareness after noticing the change in approach. They no longer behaved randomly or uncontrollably. Rather, they moved in intricate patterns as they darted and twisted across the enclosure, seemingly playing a game of strategy and survival in silence. What started out as a straightforward, chaste pursuit of hesitant prey became a complex competition requiring patience, stamina, and strategy from all parties. Although there was a noticeable sense of tension, the mood was very different from the last disaster. Respect existed between the hunter and the prey, and the soft enemy's unpredictable challenge was acknowledged. This restrained leadership style was evident in Napoleon's manner. His face displayed the composed resolve of an experienced leader, balanced by the humility learned from mistakes in the past. His gaze swept across the field with keen attention, following the movements of his prey. While he quietly gave orders to his attendants and guards, every observer could see the delicate balance he achieved between severity and respect. The mission went smoothly, despite the soft opponent continuing to be difficult and elusive. The field was no longer a scene of mayhem, but rather a meticulously planned occasion that maintained the emperor's honor and the court's customs. A noteworthy milestone was reached, and the sharp contrast between this successful undertaking and the last catastrophe was evidence of the growth and lessons learnt. The court exhaled a collective sigh of relief and redoubled confidence as the hunt came to an end. In addition to regaining authority, the emperor had shown flexibility and intelligence, qualities that are necessary for a ruler to remain in power and win the respect of his subjects. Despite being smaller in scope, the significance of this second hunt was far greater. It represented the victory of preparedness over complacency, experience over foolishness, and humility over arrogance. Napoleon and his court were deeply and permanently affected by the fallout from the second hunt, which highlighted an important reality that went well beyond hunting itself. Even though the soft adversary, those little, elusive bunnies, had not been as formidable this time, their unpredictability served as a powerful reminder that control, no matter how meticulously planned, is frequently a flimsy illusion. Conversations between advisors, generals, and courtiers in the palace's great rooms quickly moved beyond the hunt's details. Deeper reflection on the fundamental nature of leadership and power was spurred by the incident. What did that indicate about the nature of power itself? Therefore, if such small animals could rival the might of an emperor in his own domain, was power just the consolidation of territory and force, or was it something more nuanced? A careful balancing act between control and acceptance of uncertainty, authority and humility. Napoleon took in these thoughts with the sharp mind and strategic vision that had characterized his professional life. He understood that the lessons learned from the hunting grounds applied to the larger domains of military command and administration, in addition to the actual physical management of events. A deeper understanding of adaptability and resilience as essential elements of successful leadership resulted from the experience's teaching of humility, which included acknowledging boundaries and accepting ambiguity. These ideas were incorporated into the philosophies of the court's military planners and strategists. Training plans placed a strong emphasis on flexibility, fast thinking, and reactivity to shifting conditions. The complexity of war simulations and games increased, mirroring situations in which flexible strategies in response to unanticipated circumstances replaced strict plans. A timeless principle was reinforced for Napoleon by the experience. Genuine strength is not found only in overwhelming force or unwavering dominance. Rather, it is equally about having the bravery to welcome change, the humility to admit weaknesses, and the insight to recognize when to adjust. Once written off as unimportant, the soft opponent had taught a terrible but crucial lesson. It had shown that achieving lasting power requires not just winning but also having the forbearance to grow from failures, the foresight to foresee the future, and the adaptability to deal with life's and leadership's uncertainties. The rabbits were transformed from being prey into teachers in this way. Their subtle challenge changed the way the empire understood strength by serving as a reminder to those in positions of authority that mastery involves not only force but also adaptation and perseverance. Throughout Napoleon's succeeding reign, the lessons learned from the hunts against the soft enemy had a profound impact on both his own leadership style and the overall administration of his empire. What started out as an unexpected and humiliating encounter with a horde of bunnies had turned into a pivotal event that sparked a new way of thinking about power that struck a balance between strength and caution, authority and humility. Napoleon had a lifelong respect for the unpredictability of historical events and the inherent constraints of power as a result of the episode. He realized that, despite their impressiveness, the accoutrements of grandeur and command were ultimately brittle and vulnerable to the vagaries of nature and fate. His strategy was tempered by this insight, which added a sincere and calculated humility to it. Over time, the incident grew to represent enlightened leadership rather than just being a cause of embarrassment. Napoleon's administration was characterized by his ability to admit his weaknesses without losing power. Both his people and his peers admired him for striking a balance between projecting power and accepting weakness. Seeing in him a leader who could develop and become self-aware, this experience led to new procedures and reforms that went beyond the hunting grounds. They influenced diplomatic negotiations, military plans, and the management of the enormous lands he ruled. Adaptability and foresight evolved into guiding concepts that influenced choices at all governmental levels. This change was mirrored in the historical perception of Napoleon. His legacy grew deeper and more nuanced, characterized by humility-based wisdom in addition to conquest. As a tribute to the continuing strength of perseverance, the story of the soft enemy, a time of personal adversity, was interwoven into his narrative. This lesson remained relevant to succeeding generations. It acted as a reminder to leaders everywhere that real greatness demands having the guts to confront failure, the discernment to grow from it, and the grace to adjust to a reality that is constantly changing. The rabbit ambush therefore transcended its beginnings and left a lasting impression on leadership philosophy, a legacy of striking a balance between power and fragility, ambition and humility, control and acceptance. The story moved beyond its original setting as a historical curiosity and started to spread, becoming ingrained in French culture and beyond. In the years that followed the notorious rabbit ambush, once a source of royal shame, it has since transformed into a rich tapestry of artistic inspiration, folklore, and social reflection. The narrative gained traction among the general public as news of the incident circulated outside the palace's walls and the boundaries of aristocratic society. It was recounted with adornments and creative flourishes, with each narrator contributing their own unique flavor. The inconspicuous bunnies acquired symbolic meaning, their plump coats and unwavering progress serving as symbols for life's unpredictable nature and the fortitude needed to overcome hardship. The story was taken up by bards and street entertainers, who turned it into ballads and dramatic sketches that praised Napoleon's surprising humility. By adding humor and empathy to the topic, their performances softened the edges of controversy and made it more approachable for people from all walks of life. The contrast between the monarch's soft fur and royal trappings created dramatic images that were both poignant and humorous. Painters depicted the emperor surrounded by a swarm of fluffy enemies. In order to weave the occurrence into allegories about the human condition, poets created rhymes that examined themes of vulnerability and power. The story's impact went beyond simple enjoyment. It developed into a prism through which people reflected on the nature of power, the boundaries of control, and the surprising ways that fate might work itself out. Once just a game, the rabbits became powerful symbols that served as a warning that even the strongest people have to deal with circumstances that are beyond their control. The story became more and more like a myth. It evolved and changed as it was passed down through the generations, becoming richer and more intricate. The main idea remained constant, despite changes in the characters and the specifics, that humility and fortitude are just as essential to greatness as strength and ambition. The rabbit ambush had significant cultural ramifications. It influenced not just literature and the arts, but also societal perceptions of human frailty and leadership. The story provided a rare and necessary meditation on the virtues of humility, adaptation, and the grace to endure in a culture that valued strength and dominance. As the years passed, the incident's significance shifted from the actual event to the timeless teachings it represented. It served as a reminder to everyone who heard it that no crown, no matter how brilliant, is impervious to the gentlest touch, and it was a tribute to the erratic dance between fate and will, between strength and weakness. The emperor's image among his followers underwent a slight but significant change as the story of Napoleon's incredible meeting with the soft-furred enemies spread throughout society. He was no longer only the far-off, almost legendary figurehead leading troops and changing the European map. Rather, he came out as a man, flawed, weak, and human. There were important ramifications to this humanizing effect. The narrative offered the general populace a unique look behind the imperial facade, exposing a leader capable of misfortune and foolishness, traits that encouraged compassion and a sense of familial ties. This common narrative of imperfection served to bridge the often great and insurmountable gap between sovereign and subject. Thoughts on the nature of mankind and power reverberated in salons and courts. The definition of strength was disputed by authors and philosophers, who contrasted the majesty of conquest with the humility displayed in unexpected defeat. The story evolved into a means of examining the fine line that separates authority from humanity, challenging viewers' preconceived ideas about what it means to be a leader. The tale was cited as a source of inspiration and consolation during uncertain or crisis times. It served as a reminder to both public and leaders that humility is an essential quality of effective leadership, not a sign of weakness. The story promoted resiliency by demonstrating that even the most famous people experience vulnerable moments, and that a person's character is defined by how they handle these situations. Napoleon's power was not diminished by this change in attitude. Instead, it enhanced his reputation by portraying him as a multifaceted, approachable person whose resilience was matched by self-awareness and flexibility. The public's admiration and allegiance were strengthened by their acceptance of this complex picture. The rabbit ambush's humanizing influence extended into popular culture, literature, and the arts. Poems praised Napoleon's fortitude. Plays depicted the event with a mix of laughter and sorrow, and portraits of him started to show a gentler focus, originally representing humiliation. The bunnies evolved to represent the common experience of overcoming hardship. Napoleon, a leader among men, capable of both greatness and humility, became more than just an emperor through this story. He became a representation of the human spirit's resilience. The tale of Napoleon's encounter with his soft-furred enemies developed into more than just an intriguing historical anecdote. It became a fundamental lesson for both citizens and leaders, echoing down the ages as a potent allegory about the nature of vulnerability, power, and resiliency. The story was repeatedly re-examined by historians, academics, and political theorists who gleaned insights on the intricacies of human nature and leadership. It was examined as a significant example of the necessary balance between strength and humility. In addition to serving as an example of an unexpected defeat, the event made it clear that using power requires accepting one's limitations and being flexible when faced with ambiguity. The conflict between domination and submission, grandeur and modesty, and control and chaos, all of which are inherent in authority, came to be symbolized by the rabbit ambush. Its retelling served as a means of examining these ideas and provoking thought about how even the strongest leaders are influenced by outside causes. The incident sparked innumerable literary, artistic, and theatrical creations in the cultural imagination. The conflict between imperial majesty and the incongruity of his gentle pursuers was captured by painters who portrayed the emperor in a sea of resolute bunnies. Poets created poetry that celebrated the fortitude needed to confront both internal and external flaws by striking a balance between comedy and seriousness. The incident's lasting legacy was its development into a global story that spoke to the timeless human experience by overcoming space and time. It taught that having the guts to face setbacks, the humility to grow from them, and the fortitude to keep going are more important indicators of greatness than having an unbroken win. This lesson is applicable to anyone managing life's challenges and has value beyond the realm of political leadership. It served as a reminder that flexibility and resiliency are just as important as drive and strength. The story's power persisted as it was passed down through the generations, encouraging leaders to exercise their power with discernment and empathy. It acted as a warning against arrogance and a ray of hope for people who encounter obstacles in life. In this sense, the rabbit ambush became a timeless emblem and not only a curious phenomenon, demonstrating the complexity of leadership and the unwavering spirit that characterizes greatness. A deep reflection on the nature of power itself emerged in the calm moments that followed. As the reverberations of the unique quest vanished into the past, more than just a humorous or embarrassing anecdote, the rabbit ambush became a timeless meditation on vulnerability, strength, and leadership. It demonstrated that real power is a dynamic balancia, complex dance between domination and humility, control and surrender, and strength and softness, rather than a monolith of unwavering force. The softness of fur and the innocence of twitching noses contrasted with the majesty of imperial authority, reminding everyone who heard the story that beneath every crown is a human individual who is at the mercy of fate. Throughout his rule, Napoleon had demonstrated how to use force with audacious conquest and steadfast determination. However, he discovered a deeper lesson in the unexpected challenge of the soft enemy. A leader's ability to accept failure gracefully is just as important as their accomplishments. The paradoxes of authority were reflected in this story. It demonstrated that greatness involves not only the ability to exercise power, but also the discernment to recognize its limitations and the bravery to confront weakness without sacrificing one's dignity. Over time, the rabbit ambush evolved beyond its historical context to become a culturally embedded emblem that taught us about resiliency, humility, and the eternal complexity of human leadership, a lesson that continues to inspire and educate leaders of all ages. The story stands as a tribute to the timeless reality that leadership is not just the use of force, but also the acceptance of humanity. It has been many years since you were standing in the middle of Western Australia's vast red dust, holding a machine gun, getting ready for a war that no military strategist could have foreseen. A war not against men, but against an unexpected and powerful foe, the emus. When you first saw those enormous birds, do you recall how your pulse raced? They moved with incredible speed on their long, strong legs, as if they were quick winds blown across the dry plains. They were a force of nature that defied the rules of traditional combat with their elegant yet unrelenting movements. Did you ever think you would be a part of such an odd and bizarre period of history at that time? And today, as you reflect on that confusing voyage, what emotions come to mind? Is it confusion, incredulity, or maybe a sense of modest pride at having encountered such a remarkable obstacle? The memories endure, not just of the conflicts and strategies used, but also of the lessons discovered in the midst of the chaos and dust. Gunfire and engagement tactics were never the only aspects of this conflict. In many respects, it was a voyage of self-discovery. You, a regular person, put in a unique circumstance, had to face not only an outside foe, but also your own limitations and anxieties. You gained priceless qualities from the experience, such as the capacity for humor and perseverance in the face of hardship, humility in the face of failure, and patience in the face of frustration. These teachings reverberate throughout your life and go beyond the battlefield. They serve as a reminder that courage is the will to keep going in the face of fear, not the absence of it. Triumph and the grace with which one faces defeats are both sources of that power, and that sometimes one's own triumphs are the most significant. You have encountered your own battles, both big and minor, that have shaped your character and tested your willpower. Just like many others throughout history and the world, these conflicts, whether they are internal or external, shape who you are and how you deal with life's challenges. These global struggles are metaphorically represented by the bizarre, improbable, yet very human tale of the Emu War. It teaches us that obstacles in life frequently arise from unexpected sources, and that perseverance, flexibility, and the guts to keep going are more important indicators of success than mere conquering. The recollections are still clear as the years go by and the dust settles, which is evidence of life's unpredictability and the resilience of people who confront its difficulties head-on. You are a part of this continuum, connected by experience to innumerable others who have persevered through the unexpected, who have learned to laugh through adversity, and who are still fighting their own fights that will never be forgotten.